Well, that's a snazzy start. I wasn't expecting that. That's rather good. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest of our Bootham Parents talks. We had Dick Moore last week. We had Sarah Jane Blakemore talking about adolescent brain earlier in the year. We've got another one coming up at the end of February. But today we have a talk from Australia. In fact, we were slightly late starting because the treacle tin and the string were struggling to stretch, and we were having one or two technical issues, but I think we got those sorted. So we'll go ahead very shortly. I think it's fair to say that the gentleman who we're going to hear from today is probably responsible to at least a small extent for the existence of the Bootham Parents programme in the first place. I first saw him presenting at a conference probably back in about 2009 or 10. And I went to a session of his on working with parents. And I think it's probably fair to say that my experience of working with parents at that particular point was relatively adversarial. That within school, the parents were seen as much of a problem as they were an asset. And I think one of the things that Michael encouraged us to do on that particular occasion was to think in terms of partnering with parents and sharing our expertise with them as they shared their knowledge of their children with us. And that, as you'll realise, is part of the undergirding of the Bootham Parents programme that we've been exploring over the last 16 or 17 months. And so it's a great pleasure for me this morning to welcome to speak to us about helping your children with anxiety, Michael Grose, all the way from Melbourne in Australia. We've just had somebody from New Zealand in our Reflect 30 Quaker meeting first thing this morning. Michael is a very, very well-known parenting expert. He is an educator himself. He's written 12 books and done many, many a talk in his time. And it's a great pleasure to welcome him to Bootham this morning to talk to us about helping our children with anxiety. Michael, over to you, and thank you for being with us.
Good on you, Chris, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I do remember that session, not that particular session with you in it, but I do remember giving that session, talking that session, and I did talk a lot about to heads and teachers in Australia, probably New Zealand and the UK at the time, about forming partnerships with parents and running parent programs. And one of them is one of the sort of notions was to think outside the box and think outside the square. And this certainly for me is outside the square. I don't know any school that's doing Saturday morning sessions, rolling Saturday morning sessions that you're doing. So when you invited me along and I saw the program that you had, I just couldn't miss out. So I really appreciate the fact that you've invited me along, and also appreciate the fact that people have given up their time on a Saturday morning when it's about 5 or 6 degrees. So and it's a bit of a cold one over there. I live just a little bit about me, and then we'll get moving. So I come from a teacher background, primary teacher. I spent about 14, 15 years teaching, and then about 30, including some of those as a teacher, last 30 years in the parenting education area. I know York. I was there in 1981. My wife and I, then we took a year off and we spent some time in England, and we remember going to York. And also in 2009 or 2007, 2009, round about then, we did the Coast to Coast, or the Wainwrights Walk, finished in Robin Hood's Bay, caught the bus down to York and had a lovely weekend there. And then we trained it down to London and carried on from there. So lovely city, lovely part of the world. Also, we have friends whom we met in Wainwright's Walk who live in Newcastle and places like that. So we do come occasionally and visit. We also have a son in Sweden who lives in Sweden. And I've just got off a WhatsApp call with him Saturday morning his time, Saturday evening our time, and it was -6 this morning. So a little bit colder even there than where you are. So a little bit of background around the topic. As Chris said, I've been writing and speaking about parenting to parents and also working with parents when I work with educators, and I've done that basically all my life, which I've been blessed to be able to do what I enjoy. But about 6 years ago, I gave a presentation, or I thought I was going to give a presentation in Brisbane, and I did something in a professional sense, which for me was unforgivable. And that was I was to speak on the Sunday, and I arrived at the conference on a Friday night, large conference, and I had a panic attack on the Friday night. And in some ways it was always going to happen, and I just couldn't present. So I made sure that that Saturday morning there was a speaker available who could fill in for me on the Sunday. So it wasn't like I left them in the lurch, so to speak. But for me, that was sort of an unforgivable thing. I came back home. I felt relieved when I came home, went to a doctor, and he diagnosed me then with a anxiety disorder. I guess leading into that was the simple fact that I spent the previous 3 weeks sort of locked away writing, finishing off a book. So I've gone straight to a pretty high pressure conference. So I was probably very much at a low ebb. So I continued. I was diagnosed with a disorder, and part of the treatment, I guess, was seeing a psychologist. So we spent a lot of time with the psychologist, which was great. Well, I established a great relationship. But one of the things I discovered simply was that I'd always had anxiety. I didn't know it. When I went home and told my wife, she said, "Yeah, you could have told me that. Ask me, save yourself the time, save yourself the money. I've always known the fact that you've had an anxiety, not so much disorder, but you've been anxious." So at that particular time, I was also working as part of my team was someone who worked with Beyond Blue, which is Australia's mental health premier body. And her name was Dr. Jodie Richardson. And Jodie herself has an anxiety disorder. And she'd spent the best part of 20 years finding out and researching anxiety. And we had a conversation. And one of the things we said was that we figured out we don't know a lot about anxiety, full stop, from how it impacts. We know all the stats. The stats are in Australia. The stats are it takes 8 years between the first onset of symptoms until it's diagnosed. We know that anxiety, which is not managed in the early years, always shows itself later on. And I guess that's what happened to me. We also know that in rural areas in my neck of the woods, that it takes close on 18 years, average of 18 years, between the first symptoms showing through to some sort of recognition. And I guess that's the difference between sometimes in rural areas in our neck of the woods, which can be under-resourced. So we decided basically let's find out what anxiety is about. Let's create an approach. And we spent 2 or 3 years doing some research, of course, doing all other work at the same time. But that was sort of a project which we had, which we turned into a book, which has been very successful, and it's been released into Russia and China and Germany and lots of other countries, not England, unfortunately, but it's done pretty well, and largely it's done reasonably well because it's fairly practical, it's got an approach, and in some ways it's new. So what I want to do in this session is actually share some of those learnings, and I believe, and this is something I share with Jodie, that when you know better, you do better. And really, in some ways, we didn't know much about anxiety. My parents didn't know much. I didn't know much when I was raising my kids. And Jodie's mum didn't know much when she was raising hers. So when you know better, you do better. So parents are really well placed to support kids when they're anxious. So over the next 45 minutes, I want to sort of bring you up to speed on our learnings so you're better placed to support young people. So we're going to sort of head away, and and I'm a little bit unsure of what I can see and you can see, but I believe you can see a screen there, and there's a fox there. So that's really, I've moved into presentation mode now. So why have I got a fox? Well, I think a fox is a metaphor for anxiety. It sort of sneaks up in the middle of the night and does its damage when you don't see it. And we've got a lot of foxes in this neck of the woods where I live. I actually live in a semi-rural area near Melbourne. Lots of hobby farms around and lots of foxes. So the foxes are after two things. They're after lambs. When there's lambs around, there goes the foxes. And they're after the chickens as well. So a lot of the hobby farmers would keep chickens and they would get them. Very hard to kill. There's a road now near where I am. It's called Foxy's Hangout. So back in the 1930s and 1940s, farmers used to shoot foxes and hang them over the fences down there as a warning to other foxes. And also, I guess it's a look at what I've done, so to speak. So that's a tourist attraction here, and there's foxes sort of hanging from trees, effigies of foxes. So it's a well-known fox area. So one of the things is people are outsmarting foxes. You can't shoot a fox, you can outsmart a fox. And the way they're outsmarting foxes is make sure you've got a chicken pen which goes into the ground and got a roof on it. One guy has actually put on lights, so when there's movement, the lights go on. And if you've got sheep or lambs, you get alpacas, because the alpacas, foxes and alpacas aren't great friends. So that's what we're on about. We're actually not going to kill the fox. We're actually going to looking at the notion of how we can outsmart anxiety and outsmart that fox. So I think it's important that we recognize that what we grow through what we go through. So sometimes that the notion of anxiety is always linked with frailty. I see it quite differently, that in some ways being able to manage your anxiety and be able to face your fears in some ways, it's about what resilience is about in many ways. So it's not about frailty, it's more about resilience. And I guess at the moment you're going through a lot over in the UK and difficult circumstances, but hopefully it's the circumstances which we go through which often make us stronger. The other notion is that I reckon confidence is something you earn from overcoming challenges. Got to overcome challenges to become more confident, and that's an important part of this sort of approach as well. So what is anxiety? Really, anxiety is not worries and it's not thinking. Back when I was growing up, my mum used to say, stop thinking about things, stop overthinking. And that was about as close as my mum had for the notion of anxiety. She didn't know much about it. And while she was right, I shouldn't have been sitting there ruminating and tossing everything around in my head. But what she probably didn't get in some ways, that underneath all that thinking, there was a lot churning up physiologically. So anxiety is very much a physiological thing. It's actually an emotion which keeps us safe. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of anxiety when we become anxious or nervous or a little bit of tension. Sometimes that can help us perform better. Often that a little bit of tension can help us feel safe as well. It's that third sense. You feel anxious sometimes when you walk down a dark street. Well, that's anxiousness or anxiety serving you well. I mention this because at the moment, one of the things I've picked up and one of our learnings that Jodie and I picked up is that sometimes it's good to know what anxiety isn't. So a lot of people will go straight to, oh, it's anxious. He's very anxious. No, he may be anxious, but maybe he's just thinking a little bit too much. So not all anxiety is a disorder, and not all anxiety is healthy. And when it becomes unhealthy is we can't turn it off, so to speak. It's always on. And I'll talk a little bit later on about what are the signs that we need to be aware of about perhaps moving into a disorder. And picking up on Dick Moore last week, I listened to that, his presentation, terrific one. He talked about duration of distress and disability when we're looking at symptoms. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, just to give you a bit of a guide about, I wonder if my child or my young person is on the precipice of a disorder. But anxiety is normal, protects us from danger. It's our old brain which is at fault. It's the fight, flight. It's our amygdala which sits up in the old brain. It's always on. I had my two grandkids around with their parents last week, a little toddler, and I was having a bit of a chat with my son-in-law. Just out of the corner of my eye, my toddler started to totter, and he was about to fall off a landing inside. And I've just straight away stopped the conversation, just raced over and just about caught him, Slips catch, never all that great, but just stopped him from really hurting himself. And then I went back to have that conversation again, and off we went. Basically, that was the amygdala. That was the fight flight. What had actually happened is that to enable me to go from a state of calm, to being really up and just moving quickly, was my digestion just shut down. All the oxygen, all the blood just went straight to my extremity. So I was able to go, bang. So I was powered up. So what actually happens when we become anxious, it powers up our body. And what was good about that was that once the situation, the dangerous or the situation had gone, which was my young grandchild was safe, then I was able to resume. My heart rate went down again, my breathing went down again, and off I went, and just back to a conversation, back to a state of calm. So our amygdala is not meant to be activated all the time. So my amygdala was activated, my body, off I went. But when I came back, it settled down. What happens for anxious kids is their amygdala doesn't settle down. They're always in a state of high alert. And so they're in a state of high arousal. And the brain can't differentiate between a real threat and a feigned threat. So the old proverbial woolly mammoth, which kept the cavemen safe, now the brain can't differentiate between a woolly mammoth and an exam, or going into a new situation, or meeting new friends and feeling nervous. So it can't differentiate between the two. So often what we'll find is children and young people, their amygdala is highly aroused, continues to be aroused. That's what anxiety is. Another useful metaphor, is that the amygdala is like a fire alarm, a smoke alarm. It's designed when there's a fire, it's designed to go off. Many children and young people, their amygdala is far too sensitive, their fire alarm is far too sensitive. It'll go off as soon as the toast burns. And that happens in our house. As soon as the toast burns, and a little bit of toast burns, the fire alarm goes off. So it's not designed for that to happen. So as I say, some young people and some children, their amygdala or their fire alarm or their smoke alarm is highly sensitive and far too sensitive. And one way to look at it, and I look at anxiety, is on a continuum. So at one end is calm, and serotonin is the calming neurotransmitter or chemical. So the other end is arousal. So, and that's high in cortisol. I've got 3 kids, and they're all married at the moment, or married or partnered, and my wife as well. When I look at all myself and my kids and my partner, we all default to different places on the anxiety continuum. I default to about 8. And it's interesting, when I give presentations to teachers or parents around anxiety, one of the things I like them to see is watching me, or you watching me set up, because I can't stay still. I've always got to keep moving. I'm highly aroused when I actually move into a state where I feel a little bit uncomfortable. I've said some important words about understanding anxiety there. I feel highly aroused when I move into a state where I don't feel so comfortable. I think we become anxious about things we're not built for, and we're less anxious about things that we do easily. So presenting is something I have to work hard at, and so it's something I don't feel as comfortable at. So therefore, I'm often highly aroused. But generally, my arousal levels are quite high. My wife at the other end is just calm. It takes a fair bit to get her aroused and excited. That's life for my wife there. Just life's a beach. And for me to make life a beach, I got to work hard at managing my state. So one of the things about my state is we like to be sort of somewhere between calm and arousal. If we're always calm, nothing ever happens. And if we're always highly aroused, then we've got problems. And Jody, my co-author and my co-worker in the area of anxiety, she always says her default is about a 12 on the arousal level. And so I think it's good to recognize that, and it's good to be thinking, where does my child or where does my young person normally sit? Have they got are they more likely to be highly aroused? And what we're talking about a lot, and what other tools are, is how we can move down that calm mechanism. And this is what we want to be doing, is giving kids the tools to push them down, further down to number 1, rather than being up at number 10. So what we do know is that kids have a genetic predisposition to anxiety. It's about 40%. 40% of anxiety comes from the family. So if you've got an anxious child or an anxious student or an anxious young person, reasonable chance you may be, or someone in your family is anxious as well. And one of my learnings was the fact that when I learned more about anxiety, I realized that my mum had a social anxiety disorder. And one of the things which was a dead giveaway for that was that she had repetitive behaviors. Whenever she had to go out to a new social situation, my mum was always found sweeping the floor. And not only was that a safe place, but it was also the way that she was able to regain control again. We always used to joke, "Where's Mum? I bet she's sweeping the floor." And she was. And what she was actually doing, she was regaining herself. She was being a little bit like the matador who actually goes, or the bull, when in the old bullfights, when just before they're going to be their final, they'll go into themselves for that final fling. She was a little bit like that. She actually had to go into herself. And that's what some repetitive behaviors are like as well. So some kids have a genetic predisposition, but it needs the environment to switch that gene on. I always describe it as, I may have a predisposition to put on muscle mass, but unless I go into a gym or engage in activities which put on muscle, I won't put on muscle. And so just because you've got a predisposition doesn't mean that you're going to become anxious. However, there's a lot of environmental switches at the moment. And a lot of people will ask me, why is anxiety such a big issue right now? Hasn't it always been? My response to that is twofold. Secondly, if the UK is similar to Australia, we didn't have much of an understanding of anxiety 20 years ago. I know there was a very large study in this part of the world, which we'll do every 2 years, look at mental health issues for young people. 1997, it wasn't even an issue. And one of the reasons why it wasn't even an issue, it wasn't actually asked. Now, as 2015 or 2017, it's the second issue. It's the number 2 mental health issue for young people. And I guess you're wondering what the number 1 is. It's actually, it's on this spectrum, autism spectrum. So environmental switches, increases in digital devices keep the brain aroused. So we don't go into down mode, brain becomes aroused with digital devices. Highly organized lives doesn't allow young people to relax when we're on the go. It's interesting, one of my kids, who is often reasonably calm, could do a lot after school. She could keep moving all the time. Whereas my very anxious daughter, she had to be very careful about being too busy because she needed to have some downtime just to relax and to chill out. Stressed adults, anxiety is catching. It's a function of groups. It's very hard to be anxious on your own. And so it's very much a catching thing. So if there's stressed adults in the environment, reasonable chance we may have stressed kids. Sleep's a big issue, insufficient sleep. That's probably almost the number 1 environmental factor at the moment, the lack of sleep. And yes, I looked at the UK, 37% of adults in the UK say at the moment they don't get enough sleep. So we live in a sleep-deprived society. So sleep's really important for not only your mental health, but for the management of anxiety and anxiousness. And what actually happens with a good night's sleep is that it actually helps us process what happens during the day. So when you don't have a really good sleep, you still wake up with some of the baggage of the day behind, of what's happened to you the day before. You know, automatically when you've woken up with after a good night's sleep, you might be a bit foggy in the morning, but once you've got a bit of exercise or a bit of whatever, you think, oh, it's not so bad. You're ready to fight the day. That's because your brain's processed what's happened. It's given you a chance to push that aside and move on. So there's lots of aspects around sleep which are really important. So that's an environmental switch. And social media keeps us in the present as well. So that keeps us it's an aspect. And of course, right now there's a switch which we know as COVID, and the overwhelming emotion during COVID times is anxiety. If I could share, and this might be a time, Luke, just to put me up in front and center and just push the slides so people can actually don't have to. Oh, I can see, there I am. Yeah. So in Australia, we've had, as you may be aware, in Australia, we've been very lucky being an island, the fact that we haven't had a lot of cases. However, we've had two significant waves, and we've had one significant lockdown. So we had a lockdown for 4 months where we had a 5 kilometre or 3 mile radius where we could go. We had an 8 o'clock curfew. Schools were closed down. So it was a really interesting period. It was a difficult period. And we also had a first lockdown, which wasn't so difficult. One of the local councils, not my local, one of the bigger councils in a regional area, researched the impact on mental health of young people in that region. Looked at what happened with the first and the second lockdowns. And the first lockdown was anxiety, and that was in the first wave, was high anxiety, and it showed itself with lots of different anxious behaviours. The second lockdown has been depression. And so that's been primarily the emotion, which is in the mental health issue that they're facing with now, and that's followed with other issues as well. So it's been an interesting one, and I know that you're having a second go at things in some ways. So anxiety doesn't necessarily lead to depression, but often if you're anxious, you feel depressed. So anxiety is usually future focused. I'm anxious about what's coming ahead. Depression tends to be more about the past. There's also more mental health issues around that. So, and I guess that's something, and this is not a talk about depression, it's more about anxiety, but I guess it's something that to be aware of, that what may be happening and what you're feeling right now and what young people may be feeling right now is going to be really interesting. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of care, and a lot of kindness. And one of the things that we found in the schools here is that there was a conversation which went on when we had the first schools closed down the first time. The national conversation was, should we keep teaching these kids, or should mental health be the number one concern? When we had the second lockdown, which was even longer, the first conversation around learning, that almost disappeared. It became very much, we need to look after the mental health of these young people. And so learning took a back step, wasn't pushed away, but the notion of mental health for teachers, parents, the community became more important. So I'll leave you that was something just to think about. And thanks, Luke. I'm going to sort of push back now more onto the anxiety, Prezi, and we'll just keep pushing back. We've got a little bit more to push through. So thanks for that. So anxious kids fit into two groups. So they're either the controllers, they overplan to minimize risks. I'll put my hand up. I'm the controller. We have a dinner party around this place, and I'll have a plan A, plan B, plan C. What happens if it rains? And how are we going to get the people away from just standing around? How are we going to what are our plans? My wife looks at me and says, it'll be right. She's fine. She's fine. So very much we overplan to minimize risks. Nothing wrong with being organised, but often very anxious people will over-organise, and that takes energy. And I guess, when I gave that presentation, and I think the one I couldn't really, I had a panic attack. One of the things was I couldn't organise like I wanted to. So sometimes controlling is an opportunity for that young person to feel safe. So sometimes we've got to allow that to a degree. And my wife's learned to go, right, okay, you can just put your plan A, plan B, and plan C into place and give us a ring when you're ready to sort of join the human race, so to speak. So controllers, you may recognise that. And there's also avoiders. And those students who resist uncomfortable activities so they can feel safe. They're the ones that don't go to maybe to camp. That's quite a common one here, through to I'm not going to try that activity I'm not going to go into that learning activity because I don't feel comfortable, I might fail. So one of the things we don't want young people to do is to avoid, because when you avoid it now, what actually happens is the same situation is going to happen next time, and it becomes a pattern of behavior. And so what we see, and one of the things we noticed, Jody and I saw, and we looked at what's working, what wasn't, was that avoiders was a avoider group was a large group of students, and sometimes the avoiding situations were the methods of avoiding are really minor, really small, but boy, it got away from things. Like this student who every time he had to go and do something he didn't like, he ended up going down and speaking to the nurse. Great, the school nurse. And the school nurse called this particular student a frequent flyer. Well, he was a frequent flyer down there, subtle way of avoiding. So you don't want students to be avoiding, or young people to be avoiding things. So one of the things we looked at was what works with young people. So when young people are anxious or have a propensity for anxiety, what works? And so I'm going to look at 5 things. So firstly is psychoeducation, explaining anxiety to young people. So one of the things about this is that when we explain anxiety to young people and practice psychoeducation, it helps them manage their own stress, and it helps them manage their own state. So the notion of explaining what happens in the brain, the notion of explaining what happens in the body, the whole aspect of what anxiety is, the physiological aspect, what happens in your brain that you start to overthink things. So becoming familiar with that. One of the things in our book that Jody and I did was we created scripts for parents to be able to talk to primary age kids. And we also created scripts for parents to talk to secondary school and secondary age kids as well. So that notion of explaining it and having a good understanding of what anxiety is about is really important. The second aspect is to build up the knowledge in a young person of their triggers and how it shows. So the triggers are, what are the trigger situations for you as a young person? What are the situations that make you feel uncomfortable, which make you feel nervous, that make you feel really anxious? And then recognizing how it shows. So the sort of common triggers are, and again, these are the events or the triggers which will hit that switch, that anxiety switch that I talked about previously. So stressful situations, I guess that's pretty obvious, but what's stressful for one young person is not stressful for another one. So what are the situations which cause stress? I've already talked about the notion of often activities that students are not built for will make them, will be behind anxiety. So Carol Dweck talked about a growth mindset. We have 2 mindsets. There's a fixed mindset, and that fixed mindset is I hear a lot in adults of my vintage, you say, I'm no good at maths. That's a fixed mindset. Carol Dweck, the researcher for the United States, says, no, we need a growth mindset. And a growth mindset basically says, yeah, you're not good at maths yet. So you can learn it, you can work at it. And we want our young people to have a growth mindset, to put the shutters up and saying, no, I'm no good at it, I can't learn it. We want them to have that possibility mindset. But sometimes there's a cost, and that cost is you've got to work harder at the things that you're not built for, or that doesn't come naturally. And sometimes when you have to work harder at that, it's more stressful. We use up more emotional energy. So, that's a very much a personal learning that I had. I found that the things that I'm not built for, that I've got to work really hard at, makes me feel quite anxious. Whereas the things which are natural, to me, I don't feel anxious at all. I might worry, I might feel a bit nervous, but I don't have the same physiological response. Change is important for me. Change is a huge one. The one thing which sits behind anxiety is control. If I know what's happening and I can control it, I'm fine. So one of my daughters, when I used to wake her up in the morning, or she woke herself up in the morning when she was in primary school to get off to school, and I come in and see her, the first question she'd ask was, who's picking me up at the end of the day? My other daughter, who was not an anxious type, her first question was, what's for breakfast? Now, my anxious daughter, it's all about, I need information. I need information. So we gave her lots of information. We say, well, I'm going to, I'll drop you off and your mum's going to pick you up. Job's right. So change is very difficult for many young people, as you know. And if you've got a child who's more got a propensity for anxiety, change is a huge issue for them. So unfamiliar events and places and new social situations. One of the 5 types of anxiety, we've got generalized anxiety disorder, separation anxiety. There's a whole bunch around phobias. There's a social anxiety, and there's also obsessive compulsive disorder. Social anxiety is a big anxiety, particularly in young people. So we see for teenagers that social anxiety is rates far higher than generalized anxiety disorder. So new social situations can be really difficult for young people. So trying to work out a little bit about what are the events which hit the switch. Again, for my anxious daughter, it always was going back to school. You'd always know that, going back to school, and she would get quite anxious about that. And even as an adult in her 30s, new situations like that, still she gets anxious, but she has tools to manage it. So recognizing how it shows in thinking. I'm not going to read those through. I'm going to show them on the screen. So obviously lots of worries. I will read that one. So obviously lots of worries and a lot of catastrophizing. So anxiety will often show in the thought processes and the language which follows the thought processes. Physiologically, it shows itself. The most common way is breathing. Our breathing becomes really rapid. And you can imagine if you're watching a tense movie, often our breathing becomes really shallow. So it affects our breathing. Stomach ache, the headaches, moving around a lot. Yawning is a really common one. Jodie, my co-presenter and co-author, she yawns a lot, and that expels the oxygen which builds up in her body when she's anxious. And the behaviors, we've talked about some of these already, so I'll just show those there. I reckon the one that I would like to just mention is that it's poor concentration. It's very hard to concentrate on something really important if you're anxious about something else. If you've got something at school that's going to happen, whether it's an exam or a student's going to give a speech in front of a group and he feels very anxious about that, and it's after lunch, it's really hard and sometimes to concentrate before lunch because everything goes on that focusing on that thing which makes you anxious. And that's the fight-flight response. That's what that's about. That's when I was able to focus fully when my granddaughter started to fall. I was able to focus fully on that. That's all I focused on. I stopped the conversation. I didn't look at anything else. I just looked at that. As soon as she was fine, then I could expand my vision. I could concentrate further. So the whole notion of anxiousness is about pinpointing, is going in and focusing and worrying on one particular thing. So poor concentration often comes with that. So when I look at my daughter, the one I keep talking about, they're the ways that show with her. A lot of self-doubt, a lot of worrying, and she couldn't keep still. She'd just be on the move all the time, fiddling, scratching, doing all that sort of stuff. And behavior-wise, she'd get very irritable. You certainly know that's happening. Okay, so that's it. It's good to be able for young people to be able to know what the triggers are and how it shows individually. And I can tell you this, part of our learning was simply this, that how it shows is very individual. Anxiety is very individual in nature, so it's different for different kids and different people. Give kids tools to manage their anxiety. There's lots of ways we can manage it, and the 3 main tools are deep breathing. Why deep breathing? Because breathing is the quickest way to engage the parasympathetic nervous system. I'll say that again. Parasympathetic nervous system. It's the quickest way to relax. And what actually deep breathing does, and if I can go back here and with a quick concentration, is anxiety exists in the old brain, the reptilian brain. Our prefrontal cortex is where our processing happens, all our thinking happens. Our conversation happens up in this neck of the woods. And what happens in an anxious moment is, and what happened in that time when I quickly raced out to catch my granddaughter was this stopped and this took over. So this takes over completely. And this is what happens when kids become anxious. The old brain takes over and it's really hard to think. So one of the things that we do know about breathing, it forms connections back between the processing brain and the old brain. So being able to take some breaths, deep breaths, really deep breaths, not shallow, but deep breaths. What that does, it actually forms a connection back. It relaxes you and forms a connection back so that your prefrontal cortex takes over. I just suggest that you do. In our book, we introduced a lot of breathing exercises to teach young people and also kids. So it's something which I do. It becomes automatic, and if we can do that, we make that automatic for kids. That's fantastic. I did a little television interview 2 weeks ago. It was in a studio. I don't feel comfortable with those because all of a sudden, all I'm doing is talking to a camera and I can hear the presenters. I've got an earplug. I was sitting there and I was waiting to be introduced, and all of a sudden I started to have thoughts, which was, what if I mess up? What if all right. So what I did then was I took some deep breaths. While I was waiting, I just took some deep breaths, 3 or 4 of them, which almost is second nature now when I'm doing something which is a little bit stressful. Just take some breaths. And one of the reasons why I did that is that deep breathing is the only physical thing that we can do, that you can do, that your young person can do, which will change your thinking and will stop that thinking. So deep breathing is really, really important as a tool. I do it a lot. I might be standing, and I encourage kids to do it a lot. If you're standing somewhere, just take a few deep breaths. Often when I come in and sit, because I need anchors to remember, when I sit at the start of the day, in my chair, I'll often take some deep breaths just to center myself. Sometimes I start presentations like this with, let's all take a few deep breaths just to center ourselves, just to calm ourselves down. Mindfulness, super important. Why is mindfulness important? Because it brings us into the present. And mindfulness is about coming into the present through our senses. And I know that you as a school value silence, which is wonderful. So if you practice silence, that's a form of coming into the present. And it's about switching off the brain. And my daughter needs a few more tricks in her sleeve to be able to switch off the brain. So more formal mindfulness activities are important for Sarah. And I also practice them as well. But it's also a lifestyle thing as well. For instance, whenever I go for a walk outside, I have a choice. I've got a choice whether I want to plan the day, think about things, or just look at nature and take in what I can see. And when I take in what I can see or listen to what I can, then my brain closes down and I'm focusing on the present. So mindfulness is a set of techniques, but it's also a lifestyle as well. So extremely important that we practice mindfulness. With our book, we've got a lot of, Jodie and I got a lot of letters and a lot of mail about our favorite mindfulness activity, which we describe in the book, which was simply, and I still use it, which is coming into the present using all the senses. So it's basically standing there. If you've got something which makes you anxious, you stand there, center yourself, take some breaths, because breathing and mindfulness goes together. And then I'll look around and name 5 things I can see. At the moment it's lights, microphone, camera, lights, light, computer, and then 4 things you can hear. It's a bit harder in this atmosphere. And then 3 things you feel in your body. It might be shirt on your skin, feet on the floor. And then 2 things you're grateful for, and 1 thing or person you love. And it's just a settling activity when you're feeling overawed or overwhelmed. So if your young person can have a default mechanism, a default way to bring them into the present, to close the old brain down which is going at 110 and they're highly aroused, so useful. And exercise, and we learn this from people on the autism spectrum, and autism and anxiety goes hand in hand. And so exercise is important because big limbed exercise gets rid of all the stresses. And it also releases endorphins, as we know. So that's a tool. If they're anxious or worried about something, we've got to get kids exercising, getting kids moving. Classrooms that do well introduce move around anxiety. And I've been working with teachers as well in this area over the last little bit. We try and introduce as much movement as you possibly can within a classroom situation, get kids moving. But at home, get kids moving, get them off the couch, get them outside, whatever it is. I know it's cold, but exercise is such an important tool. And I use it as a tool. That is, when I know I'm anxious, I've got something later on, which is a difficult thing for me, and I feel anxious, I've got to go for a walk. I've got to get moving. And that's a tool. Provide coping strategies to help kids tolerate discomfort. Now, a coping strategy is different than a tool. The tools I talked about are how we can change state. One of the things I believe it's really important that we help young people feel comfortable with uncomfortable feelings, that tolerate discomfort, that, I don't feel comfortable with this. So what do I do in the meantime? We may be 2 or 3 days where I've got to sort of look after myself and tolerate these uncomfortable feelings because I've got an exam coming up which makes me feel anxious. And rather than avoiding that, and rather than over controlling and studying, how can I do my best? How can I study? But also, what can I do which will help me just manage these uncomfortable feelings? They're called coping strategies. So kids need coping strategies. You need coping strategies as well. I've got a few listed there, but I want to ask you at the moment just to think. You might sort of read down those as well and see what's suitable and what's not. There's just a few of them. There's lots more than that. But think, what's your young person's default coping strategy? How do they cope? How do they handle the uncomfortable feelings over a period of time? How do they live with them? Apart from seeking reassurance all the time, or apart from throwing tantrums, or, how do we manage them? For me, so I want you to be thinking about that. So think about what's your default. And if you can't think of one, talk to your young person about that. How do you manage your stress? How do you handle it? So for me, it's positive distractions. I've got to distract myself. And I usually do that by going to the gym, a lot of exercise. So I could distract myself by drinking, but I don't want to do that. That's unhealthy. So it's positive distractions. But there's a lot of different ways, a lot of coping mechanisms and coping strategies. And our research told us that young people who manage their anxiety also have a broad array of coping strategies they can call on. They can articulate them and they can call on them. And of course, creating positive lifestyle habits to minimize anxiety was also something which works with young people. I've talked about good sleep habits, and I'll keep moving on. Time in nature, important to get out into nature because our brain feels safe in nature. Intuitively, when you're outside in the forest or by a beach, you suddenly feel relaxed. That's because the reptilian brain, the old brain, makes, we feel safe in nature. And thousands of years of biology has not just changed overnight. So plenty of movement. I've talked about that. Got to get kids moving. Lost in leisure. Brene Brown, the researcher from the United States, social researcher, talks about the importance of play. We need to have play in our lives. And she says the opposite of play is depression. And I couldn't agree more. So young people need to have leisure time. And one of the things we found in a lockdown here is that sometimes young people lost the things that they found enjoyable. They lost their leisure activities. So we had a lockdown in winter. So a lot of the young people around here played Australian rules football or soccer, your football. They couldn't play that anymore. So they've lost a lot of those activities which they which are playful activities, which are good for their mental health. And I think that the notion of leisure, that everyone needs something in life which has the 3 F's. And the 3 F's are of play. It's free. I choose to do it. So your young person needs to have something in his or her life which they're free to choose. It's not, I do this because my mum wants me to do it, or the school wants me to do it. It's something I want to do. It's fun, it's enjoyable. I love it. And flow. Flow means I get lost in it. I absolutely get lost in this activity. I've got to get called in away from playing outside by mum because I just lose track of time. Now, I know that fits some gaming, some video games, things which kids will fit, that the 3S will fit that. But I'm probably thinking more healthier activities, outside activities, or activities such as hobbies. And we saw in lockdown here in this neck of the woods, a lot of young people took up inside indoor hobbies as well. That's terrific. It's all about getting lost in leisure and good gut health. I couldn't. This is so important. 90% of serotonin, which is what calms us down, 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut. And so good gut health is important. When kids have too much sugar, it doesn't produce serotonin, it shuts it down. Young people, when they spend all their time on a digital device, when you spend all your time on your digital device, what happens is you'll get a dopamine high. Each time when you reach out for that digital device, when you pass it and you go, oh, I wonder if I have any email messages. Oh, I wonder if someone loves me. And we pick it up, dopamine hit. So we get hooked on dopamine. That's cool. Okay, I get that. The only trouble is our gut doesn't produce serotonin when dopamine's produced. So the serotonin levels go down when the dopamine levels go up. So good gut health, which is non-processed foods, very natural foods, is essential as well. So as a lifestyle habit. So, and just going to sort of, before I wind up, and I know I'm going to just talk a little bit. I just want to go back and revisit those 5 aspects which work well with young people. They are explaining anxiety to them, psychoeducation, let them know what the triggers are for their anxiousness or anxiety and how it shows individually. What are the tools that you can give and help your young person develop to manage their state? What are the coping strategies that they can articulate, that they can use for various times, various aspects of their lives? We're just finished in a study with 10-year-old girls called Teenagers here, and which is quite a stressed group in many ways. But 2 coping mechanisms which they talked about was music, is one of the ways that they cope, and exercise, or not so much exercise, sport. So sport and music for those 2 age groups were strong coping strategies. And the last is, what are the lifestyle habits, the good lifestyle habits, which will help minimize anxiety over a period of time. I just want to briefly, talk about how to respond to a young person's anxious moment. So we all know those anxious moments when a young person might come up to you and say, oh, I don't want to, I can't do this, I'm not going to do it, or whatever it is, and become really anxious. So what often happens is that we have what we call an anxiety dance. The young person will seek out the parent who's going to reassure them. They'll come up to that parent, and that parent will reassure them. The child will go away, then they'll come back again, more reassurance. And so a dance occurs. Or they'll seek out the parent who's perhaps a soft touch and will actually help them avoid whatever it is that's going to be. So what do we do in an anxious moment? Oh, here we go. I'm having a panic attack. Calm down. Oh, it worked. If only it was that easy, folks. If only it was that easy. We were overwhelmingly told by young people that they wanted someone in their lives to validate how they feel. Validation means that someone gets it. I see you're really nervous about this. That makes sense. I see this makes you anxious. Oh, this is why you've been behaving like you are. It's the fact you feel uncomfortable about going to. That notion of validation is important. Now, it's a fascinating one. You may not understand while a young person is anxious about something. That's not the key. The key is to understand that they are anxious. So validation is important. What kids told us was that they don't want an adult who will dismiss it, dismissive, ignore it, get over it, build a bridge. They want someone to take it seriously. What we also do when we talk to professionals is, and the kids weren't so articulate about this, but from professionals, is the simple fact is that they also need a parent who says, that's enough. That's enough talking about this now. Let's move on. So we need a little bit of nurturance and a little bit of firmness as well, that balance. And I guess one of the things is that sometimes we just want to fix things. I think sometimes dads, we just want to fix things for our daughters and job's right, all safe. And mums, sometimes we want to fix things for our sons. We want to take away the pain or make things easy for them. No, sometimes kids need to feel uncomfortable with the struggle. They need to feel uncomfortable with that. But it's reassuring for them to feel validated. Because the one thing you want to feel when you're anxious is you want to feel safe. You want to feel safe. Reassurance sometimes makes you feel safe. Avoiding something makes you feel safe. When I avoided that presentation 6 years ago, I came home and I felt safe. Didn't feel good because I'd done something that I didn't feel professionally was great, but I felt safe. But also validation helps kids feel safe when they go, someone understands me. Someone understands me. Now, the notion of a response, we call it stay sober. And this is something you can teach young people, is that when something happens and we become very anxious about it, often we'll react. We'll go into reaction mode. Very quick story, true story, very quick story. And this is an adult one, adult story. It was Jody and I, the two authors of an anxious kids book. We flew up to Sydney so we're Melbourne based. Sydney's an hour flight away. We flew up there and did a couple of days of publicity. And we had a PR person for a day, and then for a day we just did it ourselves. They gave us some taxi tickets and off we went. And it was a very busy schedule, but we went to one particular early morning, second day, we went and did an interview, but went to the wrong address. And so without thinking, we reacted. We both of us looked at each other and go, we've got to get to the right place. And we rang a taxi. The taxi came and we quickly hopped in the taxi, and the taxi took us to this other address. And as we're going there, we suddenly realized if we make this one, we won't be able to make any of the others. The whole day's gone. So we made a phone call, and actually we told the taxi driver, the only sane person in that taxi, he said, yeah, you're right, you won't make it. So we rang the studio and said, sorry, we can't make it. We'll come in and we'll do a pre-record another time. Job's right. So what had happened was that we just reacted. So sober means, rather than reacting, see if you can stop yourself, observe what's happening inside. We were talking faster. We were moving. What was happening in our stomach. Our breathing was high. See if you can get kids just to observe. See if you can do that. Observe what's happening. Take that deep breath. Engage the parasympathetic nervous system. Get the old brain linking up with the processing brain, the thinking brain. Expand your vision. We suddenly, as we're sitting there, we started to expand the vision. One of the things we saw as one interview is not important, missing a whole lot is. So expanding our thinking. So sometimes we need to remind kids to sit back and think what's important. And then you make a response. Okay. And in this case, we made a phone call and then we went on with the rest of our day. So stay sober is a great little acronym to remind yourself and to teach kids. So it's that mention of stopping, observing what's happening internally, breathing, take a breath, expand your vision, think a bit broader, and respond. What we know about this is you've got to practice this in no stress situations so it becomes fairly normal. The last is develop an action plan together. So if you've got a young person who's anxious about something, we don't want them to avoid it. The notion of gradual immersion, gradually immerse kids in the things which makes them feel anxious, and that will actually help them get over the anxiety. So gradual immersion. I've had some fun over the last couple of years helping young people overcome some really things which have held them back. One, for example, was simple one, but it's a common one in Australian schools was a 13-year-old who didn't want to go to school camp, and this was a school that had a big camping program, and this young person had gone through primary school, never been on a school camp. So the program we did was just gradual immersion. We made sure that he camped. He'd never been on a camp with his parents either, so they went on a camp for a couple of days. He started a camp in the backyard. He had a friend over for a camp, and so they just gradually immersed and build up his confidence and build up his skills. So develop an action plan together if a young person's anxious about how they can overcome that anxiety, even if it's one step at a time, even if it's, I've got to give that, it's I want you to be on stage. Well, maybe it's start off behind, doing some jobs behind, off stage, feeling comfortable, and then moving ahead. So developing that action plan is really important. And the last thing I just really want to talk about is, again, that was about just a quick, what do you do in the moment? Don't respond. What we need to do is to validate kids rather than reassure. Make sure that we pull back, stop, think, observe, and teach our kids to do the same. And then start to think, how can we help this young person overcome and face the fears so that they can handle the issue which makes them anxious. All right, so stepping back a little bit, when should we worry? And Dick Moore last week spoke about the duration of an issue. He spoke about the level of distress that a young person may feel. He also spoke about disability. So I'm from Beyond Blue, which is Australia's premier mental health organisation, government-backed. They have 5 aspects. Firstly is a change in behaviour. Have you seen a change in behaviour in your young person? Does it, what are you seeing differently? Has the change occurred in multiple settings? Is it just happening at home, or is it happening at school and happening in other areas of life? And I guess it's difficult at the moment if they're not at school and they're all spending all their time at home. But just normally, is it changing across multiple settings? Does it occur frequently? And I guess frequently is open for discussion what frequently is, but not just once or twice, but happens a lot. Behaviour goes on for more than 2 weeks. So 2 weeks gives you a time frame to work with. And the most important one, as far as I'm concerned, is it impacting on their regular daily life? Usually, are they stopping doing the things that they used to enjoy? Is this impacting on their life, and they're not going out and doing those things that were part of their life? That's the time when we need to, I think, go to a general practitioner or go to school. And I'm a big one for developing not just a plan, but having support people around a young person to assist. So I'm going to finish off in a minute because I've sort of gone over time, and I apologise for that. But I just wanted to touch on the notion of, I think it's important that we as parents at the moment practice self-kindness. One thing I don't want you to do is look at this and go and feel more anxious about your young person when you came in. And that notion of self-kindness is looking after yourself, particularly at this time. And I remember I spoke to Chris when we talked about this presentation that last August in Australia, when we were about to go in, when we were starting into our second lockdown and our second wave, I gave a lot of presentations to parents and the message was, look after yourself, be kind to yourself. What do you got in your own life which is nurturing, which you enjoy? And I think in smaller ways, I've found myself, and I encourage some people just to lower the bar just a little bit. Sometimes we get huge expectations. We need to be doing things. I need to be busy. And sometimes we wear busyness like a badge. How you going? I'm busy. Oh, yeah. It's like a badge of honor. I think we need to be a little bit smarter than that in this day and age, and particularly going through what you guys are going through. So just finishing off the anxiety, I just always believe that you make a huge difference as a parent. Your response to a young person, you're tuning into your young person, your child, a young person, not being so anxious yourself, looking after yourself, being calm, developing the tools. I always believe that whatever you're going to teach your kids, you need to practice yourself. So you have a feeling, you have an understanding about that. And I've got a feeling that many of you may be looking at this morning going, maybe I'm a little bit more anxious than what I thought. So, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. So it's good self-knowledge, that awareness. So your approach to this makes a huge difference to your young person. So, and that's what we want to do. As we started off at the start when the presentation, it was about there's the fox. What we want to do is we want to outsmart that fox, and we outsmart that anxiety fox by developing young people's knowledge of their brain, particularly their brain and what happens up there. And that's fantastic that that's part of this program is that Chris has organised for you guys around the adolescent brain. Really important that sort of understanding. Having tools in your toolkit is so important, not just one, but having a number of different tools in your toolkit to manage your state, how to cope, and also just little bit by little bit by little bit, having a little look at the different aspects of lifestyle so that it minimizes the likelihood of anxiety. If you're going to start anywhere on those, and again, don't start everything at once. I always think whenever you want to make some change, just change one thing and think, oh, that's going okay, now I'll move on to that. If you're going to look at one thing in the tools, I would always start with breathing. Introduce the concept of deep breathing to young people, to your child. Do it with them. Practice it yourself. So start with that. If there's one thing that I recommend in the lifestyle angle, it's sleep. Develop a sleep framework. And our sleep framework is find your optimal bedtime. Make sure that your young person has a regular relaxing routine before bed. Eat and exercise at the right time. When you eat, you've got to not eat too much before the kids go to bed. Often our sleep time is ruled by other aspects, but if we can put eating and exercising down and then work our sleep from there, and really we should be sleeping about 3 hours after the main meal. Hard, I know, but sort of look at that aspect. Create a sleep sanctuary. Don't allow your young person to sleep in their bed to do homework on their bed. If they're doing their homework on their bed, then they'll associate their bed with work. So sleep, the bedroom is a sanctuary for sleep. I know some young people and children will work in their bedroom. That's okay. That's, ideally I prefer that not. I prefer them to work elsewhere so that the bedroom is associated with sleep. It's a sanctuary. But if they are going to work in their bedroom, make sure they don't work on their bed. They can have a read before going to bed. They can listen to something which puts them to sleep, but their work goes somewhere else, because location will always carry memory. So the location of bed will actually carry the memory of work. And the last, make sure your kids get up at a regular time. This is a huge one, because the sleep clock resets itself every day. So when kids get up, open up the curtains, the sleep clock is actually reset. So when kids sleep in for a long time on weekends, it throws the sleep clock around. A lot we need to learn about sleep, but if there's one area to focus on, I reckon it might be sleep. Chris, I'm going to toss back to you, but I will actually just let people know if they want to find out a bit more about Anxious Kids. So on Amazon, there's a digital version, and there's also a audio version as well of Anxious Kids. And the reason we chose the lovely cover, the colourful cover, is that we want young people to live life in full colour. And we know when you're anxious, everything can seem grey. So we want you to be able to live with anxiety, push it to the background, turn the dial down a little bit. And so we live our lives in full colour.
Michael, thank you so much for that presentation, and particularly the practicality of it all. Those people who are watching us on YouTube and Facebook, and Michael, we have to fill a bit of time here because they're about a minute behind us talking about it. You can put questions on the chat if you have them now. We've got about 10 minutes for questions if you'd like to add any on. So just type away. And they'll come up and we can see them. Michael, I just want to ask you a little bit about the link between anxiety and perfectionism, because some of the research that I've been doing with sort of independent schools nationally shows that perfectionism, we can understand this, can't be, is on the rise. And what do you think the interconnection between those two things is?
Yeah, it does. There's no doubt. It's the fact that in some ways it's linked back to that over-controlling. And so it takes a lot of energy. So perfectionism and anxiety, I would put them as very good bed buddies. They're related to each other. So yeah, perfectionism is on the rise. Interestingly, I'll just touch on that, the fact that I just put the finishing touches 2 days ago on a birth order book, re-looking at my birth order book, why firstborns rule the world and lastborns want to change it. And one of the things that comes strongly through there is firstborns are perfectionistic, and they're more likely to be perfectionists than any other birth order group. And perfectionists and firstborns always perform highest in conscientiousness. So that conscientiousness sometimes turns itself into perfectionism. So yeah, we've got to be really careful with perfectionists. And I guess one of the things is that we've got to be careful ourselves as parents not to expect everything to be perfect, that near enough's good enough. And I just think excellence is good enough. So that's a good point, that we need to be careful about that aspect of expecting our kids to be perfect all the time. Another aspect about that is about perfectionists. I think it's important to take them, if you're living with perfectionists, they're difficult to live with, and you've got to take them seriously as well. It's a little bit like anxious kids, you need to take them seriously. But yeah, I think there's a link between the two.
Terrific. No questions coming through yet. So I was about to ask you about sleep, but you actually preempted that.
All right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're going to have another talk in a few weeks' time about digital health. I'm wondering what your take is, particularly on digital devices before bedtime and that sort of thing.
Yeah. The recommendation is 45 minutes to 60 minutes. Don't look at your digital device for 60 minutes before going to bed. But I think it works on two aspects. I'm a big believer in the aspect of, if you've got a child or a young person who's got a propensity to be anxious, is to minimize, not take it away, but to be really careful and make them really aware about overusing that digital device. It works on two aspects. Firstly, it does keep the brain aroused. It's the blue light. It keeps it aroused. And the second thing, that often will bring you out of the present and into the future. You look at the emails, you might be relaxed, and suddenly you look at emails, or you look at social media, and suddenly you're taken to another space. And so I think that's a really important aspect if we're looking at digital devices and also mental health, particularly anxiety.
Got a question back to sleep from Janet, who says, many children experience fear at night time, which creates anxiety and affects going to sleep. Any tips?
Yeah.
Sort of literal night terrors, I suppose.
Yeah, again, a lot of the fascinating thing about sleep as well, for some young people will worry, and so it stops them from going to sleep. And some young people will worry about not getting to sleep. And then there's the other aspect around sleep, which is the phobias, scared of the dark, the monsters under the bed, which young people have. And if we link anxiety back to lack of control, it's important that young people and kids, I'm obviously talking about children at this age, that they have a feeling of control. So night lights work well. You can play the game with them as well, where you look under the bed and go, oh, well, there's nothing there, but okay. If something happens, then you can come to me. Normally they can't, but if something happens, you can come to me. And you can leave the light on so that the kids can actually come out to you. It's also useful for kids to go to bed with some relaxing music as well, so they put themselves to sleep with something really relaxing. There's a lot of apps available right now that kids can use. So if they are feeling nervous and afraid of the dark, sometimes those apps really work as well. And I guess part of your routine can be, and I've seen this in some instances as well, a part of your routine for some children who are scared of the dark or need some settling down is just to rub their back, is to spend 5 minutes actually rubbing their back and talking to them in a soothing voice, just calming them down. If you're very clever, you'll actually rub their back when they breathe out. So that actually breathe out, rub, breathe in, breathe out, rub. And actually that's what you do with babies to help them go to sleep. You rub on the exhalation. So if you rub their back on the exhalation, and sometimes that's worth spending that little bit of time as well. And that can be, for some kids, part of the routine, depending on how bad it is. I always have the notion that the less we as adults interfere, the less they're with kids. We don't want to make them dependent on us, but sometimes we need to do that. But there's some ideas there.
So a question here from Marta, who obviously has an anxious child, but the child is very loud and very active constantly. And she's really asking about, how do you begin a conversation? How do you find the time to start a conversation, or to actually teach them mindfulness when they are very active characters?
Yeah, good point. I often start and say, where's your relaxation place? Where's your conversation place? When's the time when your young person or your child is calm? There needs to be a calm spot. So there needs to be a place in your house, and I don't know if there is, but not sure of that situation, but I think every house needs a conversation place, and that's a place where we talk, and also needs a calm place. So interesting one and that might even just be a section of the room, of a room. If you're in an apartment, if you're in an apartment, for example, you might not have a lot of room, but you might have a part of the living room, which is a quiet place where noise isn't made, where kids can go and put headphones on and just relax. There might be some bean bags there. So creating a calm place. And this is important for schools as well, to have places of calm. So when you've got a calm place, so your young person or your child can go there, and it might even be some music, and put some headphones on just to calm and relax, and just to watch that body exhale, so to speak. If you have it, I think that's the first thing you need to do, is to make sure that your young person or child has a place where they can go and relax. And then when they do, if you've established that, that's when you have your conversations about these things, that you talk it through, but in a relaxed way. We can't tell kids what to do, but we can actually choose when we tell them things and the place in which we tell them. So we need to choose times when they're relaxed, when we're relaxed as well, and we're not stressed and we're not anxious. And also we need to choose times when the kids have turned the dial down. So there must have times of the day when that dial's turned down. And you may have some language around the fact that that's a loud behavior, you need to do that outside, or that's a loud behavior, we don't do this in this part of the house, we do it elsewhere. Bedrooms sometimes make a great place for that as well. I like the word as a bedroom as a sanctuary. It's a sanctuary for sleep. And so it's a quiet place for kids. And that might be a place when your child is relaxed. Again, rubbing your back. Touch is one of the best ways you can actually relax somebody, and then have those conversations when they're relaxed. It's interesting. One way you can calm kids down is, and you need to be relaxed yourself, is by your own touch. If you're feeling relaxed and calm, you can put your hand on a child and just calm down. Come on, just calm down. And and your calm can leave you and into your child. It doesn't work if you're stressed or you're not calm. So it doesn't. That technique has never worked for me. I couldn't do it. But my wife can do that, and she could do that. I've never seen her do it, I should say, but she could do that. She's quite a calm person. So again, let's create some calm first before you have the conversations.
Michael, let's wrap this up there with a huge thanks from us on this side of the world for your time on that side of the world. Thank you for the expertise you brought with us today. Particularly thank you for the huge number of practical tips and things that we can consider. Very often in these talks, we understand, what the problem is and what might cause it. And I think the physiology is something we've become quite familiar with. But to have those practical tools and a recognition of coping mechanisms and things like lifestyle changes, I think is really very, very important for us. And we're very grateful for it. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope things go really well for you, and maybe one day we might even see you back in York and you can come and speak to us face to face. That would be a real joy.
That'd be fantastic. Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for giving up your valuable time on a Saturday morning on the weekend. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, and best wishes for. I know you're going through a difficult time at the moment, so we want to see you in English out here next year, playing cricket at the MCG.
We'd like it too. That would be great. Lovely to see you.
Good on you.
Just as a parish notices for those of us here, we have another talk. I think in 3 weeks' time, 27th of February, we either have one or both of Charlotte and Emma Robertson, who are known as the Digital Sisters, who are going to be talking to us about a healthy digital life and how we as parents can help our young people with that. One other thing to say is that we're beginning to plan for the summer. We're planning probably to stay online, even if we are able to get back into school at some particular point in time. And I'm just wondering what the topics are that you might like us to cover, or you might like us to find some expertise that we can sort of share with you. We've done a lot of stuff around mental health. There may be a much wider range of things that you're interested in. So please do, either on the chat before you leave, or maybe by sending an email in to me at school. Let me know the things that you might consider to be topics that we could help you with and find people to help you with. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend. And we will see you hopefully on the 27th of February for the next exciting instalment of Saturdays for Bootham Parents. Thank you very much.